A few weeks ago, I uploaded a video about setting up your Google Streamer for gaming. One of the options I explained was retro gaming using Retroarch. It's a great app and will allow you to play many retro systems, but it can get tricky to use if you don't have previous experience with it. Let's check how to set it up for a Google TV. Before I start, big shout to the wonderful Retro Game Corps, which is the best channel for retro gaming bar none. If you are interested in this topic, I seriously recommend you to check it out. Now, let's jump into it. So, Retroarch is not strictly speaking an emulator, but a front end for a number of emulators. What Retroarch does very well is A. Handling many old systems, and B. Giving you access to all of the functionality including remapping controls and the like. What Retroarch does quite badly is two things. A. Make those things simple, and B. Make things look pretty. Hopefully this video will help solve at least one of those things, but for making things pretty, we might need another video about dedicated front ends. Okay, so for starters, remember that we need to install it by sideloading it from the Retroarch website. You can use Downloader for that. Please do not install it from the Google Play Store. I know there's a version there, but that one is missing a lot of updates on things you are going to use, and if you do it that way, you will miss some stuff later. Okay, so with that out of the way, you will need a bunch of ROMs with your games and also a bunch of BIOS files. The BIOS files are needed for some of the emulators, not all of them. Unfortunately, for both ROMs and BIOS files, it's illegal to share them since they are subject to copyright. They aren't hard to come by, but I will not provide them here for legal reasons. I will recommend that for arcade games, try to find a Final Burn Neo ROM collection instead of a MAME. It will make your life that much easier. I always create a games folder, and inside I have a subfolder per system that I want to emulate, and then another folder where I store all the BIOS files. With all this sorted out, you can open Retroarch. From now on, you should be able to use your controller for everything. If it's not working right now, make sure you check what's going on with your pairing inside your Google TV, because it should be fine. We'll start by setting our directories properly. The app created its own, but you might want to redirect a couple of things. Let's change the BIOS folder and the file browser to point to our games folder. Every time you do any relevant changes, I recommend you to go to Main Menu, Configuration File, and Save Current Configuration. That way, you know your changes are permanent in case of a crash or something else. Then let's go to Online Updater. Here we are going to start by downloading the cores. What are those? Well, you can think of them as the actual emulators. Each of those cores allow you to play a different system. I'll come back to this in a moment, but just a passing comment to state that you also want to download almost all the other elements listed on that menu. Just update everything: core info files, assets, controller profiles, cheats, databases, overlays, and shaders, and you'll be fine. I personally prefer to not use the playlist thumbnails updater, but to use the option right below, on-demand thumbnails downloads. That way the picture that will show up next to every game will download once as needed, instead of the whole list in one go. But this is totally personal preference. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to choose some systems that I think will be appropriate to recreate issues that might affect the average user. They will give us the excuse to talk about a number of features. So let's first pick, of course, an arcade core. The one I prefer is called Final Burn Neo. And we also pick MAME as a backup for the odd ROM here and there that Final Burn Neo can run. For 16-bit consoles, let's pick the Sega Genesis, aka Megadrive. Here we want Genesis Plus GX, and we'll grab Genesis Plus GX Y2 for an interesting test. Personally, I will also pick another very famous 16-bit console from the competition, but with the current state of affairs and their legal actions, I'm not even going to name that other company. For older computer systems, I'm going to pick my old favorite, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, which was the first computer my family ever owned, and I know really well. There's only one core here, Fuse, which thankfully works pretty well. I'll pick the MSX2. I never owned one, but one of my best friends did, and it has a few great games that I remember fondly. There are two possible cores here, Blue MSX, and depending on how adventurous you feel about finding BIOS files, I also recommend FMSX. One very interesting system to try is DOS games. You will think they will be unplayable without a keyboard and very difficult to configure, but things have improved lately thanks to this core DOSBox Pure. As far as slightly more modern systems, let's try the PlayStation 1, as it was a pivotal system and it's up there at the top of what you will probably want to emulate with Retroarch. For now, our core here is PCSX rearmed. We won't even bother with something like the PS2. If you want to do it properly, you can do it inside Retroarch. You will need a standalone emulator. I won't add any retro handheld consoles either. I'm not a big fan of emulating those on a big TV. It always looks bad, and most of those are owned by the unnamed company that is closing emulators left and right. I've tried the PSP on my TV, and frankly, even cranking up the resolution, it looks underwhelming, because it's not meant to be played on such a big screen. Now let's make our UI look a bit cleaner. Go to Settings, User Interface. At the bottom there's a menu option. That allows you to change the skin of the whole interface. Personally, I prefer the one by default called Ozone. It's a bit ugly, but I know it really well. I do know that many users prefer the one called XMB, which has a very classic PlayStation look. You'll need to restart Retroarch to see the new menus. From appearance, you can change the scale factor to better fit your screen. You can also choose the primary and secondary thumbnails that you'll see on the playlists by default, although you can still change that from each of the playlist settings. Whatever your preferred skin, you can change the main color here. For Ozone, I favor Nord, but I encourage you to try several. Same if you use XMB. Still inside settings, let's jump into menu item visibility. These are some added sections on the main menu that appear by default, and frankly, some of them we won't need at all, and it's just clutter. I always switch off images, music, videos, netplay, content-less course, and explore. I know some people like to hide favorites and history too. Feel free to pick your own menus, but make sure you don't hide settings, import content, and playlists, since we really need those very often. You will need to restart the app to see the changes, so let's do that now. But first, remember to save your settings. At this point, people usually like to add some hotkeys so that you can open the menu, quit the game, or do things like save states. I used to do it, but lately I've noticed there's a button in my gamepad that opens the menu by default and allows me to do all that, so I don't bother anymore. But feel free to do it from Settings, Input, Hotkeys. Okay, so with all that ready, let's start to create our games playlists system by system. Let's start with arcade games. Go to Import Content, Manual Scan, and in the next menu pick the folder with the ROMs, the correct name for the system, and the core you want to use for emulation. Then you scan that and you will find a new menu item with that playlist. That's a start. Still, you will probably see many of the items are not being added thumbnails. This is because the naming of the games called scraping is not very good in Retroarch. Basically, if it fits the naming in this libretto list from this address, then it gets recognized. Obviously, that works if you have to rename one or two items, but for dozens, it gets too slow. There are two things we can do about it. One, we can look for an XML file for our system. It's not very hard for arcade systems like Final Burn Neo, but it gets harder for other systems. The other alternative which I recommend is to download in your PC a free app called Scraper. It's not the most intuitive interface, but it will allow you to go through your folder and download the thumbnails and any box art that you might need, and it will put them into folders with the right structure for Retroarch. And then it's just a matter of going to your folder in Retroarch called Thumbnails and pasting those folders inside your chosen system. There you go, a nice looking playlist. Okay, finally let's run a game. This one will do. Now, with a little bit of luck, you won't need to make any changes to the controls, since the default controls for arcades match very well our gamepads. But let's assume you do want to change the odd button here and there. So jump into the menu and go to Controls, Port 1 Controls, and change whatever you need. After you've tested it and you're happy with it, I recommend you save those control changes by going into Manage Remap Files, Save Game Remap Files. Now, you've probably noticed that things look a little bit too crisp for your taste on your big TV screen. These games didn't have huge resolutions, and the original screens were CRTs, so here they look a bit dated. One thing we can do to make it slightly better is to use video filters or shaders. Of the two, I recommend shaders, since they look much better and there's more variety. Let's go into Settings, Video, and change our driver to Vulkan. Save your configs and restart Retroarch. Then make sure from the online updater you got the slang shaders. Now run one of the arcade games again and jump to the quick menu. Go to Shaders, Add Shader preset. Now, there are some really amazing shaders that can replicate the curvature of the glass of an arcade, the reflection of the screen, and a long etc. But they are very demanding and frankly a bit distracting. So I'm going to recommend this one, CRT Set Fast, which will give us some nice scan lines and tones that behave well for most basic situations and is very light on the device. Now go to Save Preset, and here I recommend you save it for the whole folder. In Retroarch you can always save for the whole folder for a core or for a specific game depending on your needs. By saving here for the folder, we are telling Retroarch we want all our games inside this folder, so all these arcade games to use this shader. If we ever want a different one for a specific game, we can still save it for that game, and it will override the folder setting. And with this, I think we're pretty much done for arcade games. Let's enjoy some of these. Alright, time to jump to the Sega Genesis, also known as Megadrive. With experience of arcade games before, we should go quicker now. Let's create the playlist just like before. Now we are going to add Genesis Plus GX as our core, not the white version. We'll test that other one in a minute. As expected, things should work pretty good from the get-go. I'm going to keep on using the same CRT shader for this as it looks quite nice. Also, controls should be fine by default, but now you know how to modify that if you need the odd button change. So what is the wide core thing? Basically, some games have been hacked so that we can play with them using a widescreen. It makes for a better experience with our modern screens and some people really like it. Clearly it looks different from what the original developers did, so that's why some other people hate widescreen hacks, which I can also understand, but it's good to have the option. Now, this doesn't work with every game as I'm going to show. If we try something like Castlevania Bloodlines and compare with and without the widescreen hack, you'll see how cool it looks. In order to make it work, with some games we need to go to the quick menu inside the game and change core options, video, borders to full and then back to off, otherwise it will look wrong. It actually makes the game look a bit more modern. And we can see enemies earlier. Is that a good thing though? Well, that's a personal decision. Again, with something like Super Hang-On, it works pretty good. So many sport and racing games on the Genesis. It was the sports console back then. But if you try another banger like Desert Strike, you can immediately see the issues. The game isn't ready for that. So there you go. An amazing system to play with. There are so many great games here. Also, if you want to, you can use the exact same Genesis Plus GX core for Sega CD games, but I recommend you to create its own playlist for that, as it was a different device. Next, let's jump into 8-bit computers and add my first personal computer ever, Sinclair ZX Spectrum. For starters, we do the same thing that we've done before. There's only one core here, Fuse. As you see, I always use the option Scan Inside Archives. That's because I commonly keep my ROMs in zip files, and in the past, while not on this option, I noticed I was missing some of the games. There we go. Now with the Spectrum, there are some control remapping aspects to talk about. We can select if we want to go with one of the joystick options such as Kempston or Sinclair, or a keyboard. No matter what we choose, we can always access an on-screen keyboard by pressing the select button on our gamepad. Personally, I prefer to map keyboard keys to my gamepad, because even if you had the joystick option, some of the games needed some extra keys. The way to do this is to just go to the control menu and at the top, select Sinclair keyboard, and now go button by button choosing the right key. I usually add a couple of keys to start and select for the menu as well. Once you're done, remember to save the game control config so that you don't have to do it again, and you should be good to go. If a game requires a beefier machine than the 48K, the emulator also allows you to pick one of the other Spectrums, which will be a requirement for some of the later games. With this done, the MSX should be very similar. There are two cores here that work well, but I personally prefer FMSX. But as mentioned at the beginning, you will need the BIOS files for that one. Whereas you can get everything you need from Retroarch if you go with Blue MSX. It's up to you. The default keys tend to work well, but some older games require the key 1 to start the game, so you might need to reassign that. Now, the one thing I haven't been able to do with either of the two MSX cores is to show a virtual keyboard on screen. It works for every other emulator, Spectrum, Amstrad or Commodore, but I don't think there's a way to do it for MSX, which is a bit of a downer to be honest. They used to port some Spectrum games to MSX too, but frankly the best games for the system are those that were originals, like Hello Mr. Metal Gear. Alright, let's try DOS games now. So as I said before, using DOSBox straight away used to be quite tricky, mostly because of the controls being very hard to remap. But now we have this nifty core called DOSBox Pure, which makes things way easier. To be honest, for some games nothing will work as good as a mouse, but even if you don't have one around, you can make do with your gamepad now. One bad thing I haven't been able to fix is that when we add them, we get a lot of files on the playlist, as it's adding all the executables found for each folder. So I'm afraid you will have to spend some time deleting entries that you don't need. Now, the first time you run one of those games, you will usually get this menu where you can mark the exe file to run the game, but also you have controls to change. It's very nice because whatever you add here, it will become mirrored inside Retroarch's menu. But probably you want to test the game first and then start making changes to how the controls work. And that's fine too. By pressing on the left analog stick, you'll get the virtual keyboard. And there's an option in there called Pad Mapper that allows us to jump to the control section again and change anything. You can make the sticks or D-pad work as a mouse or as any keyboard button. There's even a nice option to assign a button so that the mouse cursor moves slower to make it easier to click in on some of the stuff. Also, for some games you get automatic recognition of the game, and that gives you the controls for free. So, a great way to replay or rediscover some classics. It used to be too messy to fiddle with, but now it's actually quite fun. And last but definitely not least, let's try the PSX aka PlayStation 1. Again, make sure you have the BIOS files for this. Our core PCSX rearmed will still be able to play most of them without it, but compatibility might suffer. One important thing here is that we can use the core to up the resolution of the games so that they look a bit better. It might create the odd effect here and there, and we do get some glitchy loading screens in some games, but the games themselves look much better by doing so. One obvious banger here is Metal Gear Solid. Amazing how well this game still holds nowadays. And also, what about one of the fathers of the Metroidvania genre, Symphony of the Night? One final option for most systems. It's possible to connect Retroarch with our Retroachievements profile. If you don't know what this is, basically it allows us to play games with new achievements created by the community. The whole achievements thing is a rather modern idea, and I didn't think it would be interesting at all. But after trying it for a few months, it's actually quite fun. It just adds an extra element to the game for free. So if you don't have it, I recommend you go to the Retroachievements website and sign up, and then use your username and password here in your Retroarch profile. Then go into Achievements and enable them. From now on, every time you start a game, you will see a message about the number of achievements and how many you have unlocked. Phew, that's it I guess. This was a long video, but I hope it really helps you play retro games on your Android TV from the comfort of your couch. If it helps, please consider clicking like and subscribe. It helps me create more content like this, but even if you don't, thanks for watching and enjoy your gaming in a relaxed setting.